Okay, so, when you think about the Arctic, you probably picture like a vast frozen wasteland, right? Totally isolated and unchanging. But the reality is, it's changing fast. The ice is melting, new sea routes are opening up, and this, like, once remote area is now a major point of interest for countries all over the world. It's exciting, but also a little bit worrying, right? Because with all these new opportunities comes some pretty big geopolitical challenges.
Absolutely, and that's exactly what we're going to get into today.
Today on the deep dive, we're going to take a close look at how one major player, India, is approaching this evolving Arctic landscape. We'll be looking at their Arctic strategy and also at some recent news that really highlights the broader changes happening up north.
That's a really fascinating combination of sources. Should give us a pretty well-rounded picture of what's going on.
Yeah, and our goal is pretty simple, to give you a clear understanding of India's interests, their relationships with key players like China and Russia, and what all this tension in the Arctic could mean for the world.
All that without getting lost in a mountain of dense policy documents.
Exactly. No one wants that.
Definitely not. So, shall we dive in?
Let's do it. So let's start with India's perspective. Their 2022 Arctic policy outlines something they call a whole-of-government approach, which on the surface sounds really comprehensive, right? It covers climate science, economic partnerships, governance, the whole nine yards. But something interesting popped out to me when I was reading this. Our source actually suggests that India might be overlooking a crucial element, the growing militarization of the Arctic and the great power competition that's becoming increasingly obvious. They even propose adding a whole new pillar to their strategy specifically to address these geopolitical issues. What are your initial thoughts on that?
Oh, it's definitely a crucial point. I mean, while it's great to have a strategy that emphasizes things like climate research and sustainable development, the Arctic today is, well, it's way more than just a scientific or environmental issue. The opening up of these new sea routes, the access to all those valuable resources, these are things that inevitably attract competition. And if you look at what our second source is saying about the military buildup and the competing territorial claims in the Arctic, well, yeah, it does seem like a pretty big gap in India's strategy, something they'd want to address sooner rather than later.
For sure. And when you think about India's interests in the Arctic, it becomes even more apparent why they'd need to consider these geopolitical dynamics. They're looking at energy security, particularly as those huge hydrocarbon and mineral reserves become more accessible. Plus, the potential of these new shipping routes is huge for reshaping global trade. And naturally, India, with their growing influence on the world stage, they want to have a say in how the Arctic is governed.
Right, exactly. For India, just like for many other countries, the Arctic represents this new frontier full of economic potential. And the energy resources alone are staggering. Remember those USGS estimates? Something like a huge percentage of the world's undiscovered oil and natural gas. And when you consider the vulnerabilities of those traditional trade routes, the choke points, the longer transit times the prospect of shorter, faster shipping through the Arctic becomes really, really attractive. So that naturally leads us to the question of how practical these new routes actually are for India.
Yeah, and that brings us to the Northern Sea Route, or the NSR. It runs along Russia's Arctic coastline, connecting the Atlantic and Pacific. I'm sure some of our listeners are already picturing it on the map, but on paper it seems like a total game changer. But our source on India's strategy actually suggests that as a standalone option, it only offers limited advantages for India, which honestly was a bit surprising to me at first.
Yeah, I can see why you think that. It's geographically shorter, right? But if you think about the practical realities, it makes more sense. The infrastructure along the NSR, it's mostly geared towards resource extraction that's heading east, not really the kind of trade flows that would be most beneficial for India. Plus, the ice conditions, needing ice flaker escorts. It adds a lot of cost and unpredictability, especially compared to the shipping lanes India already uses. So for their cargo, at least as a direct standalone route, it's not quite as appealing. But here's where it gets interesting. What if you connect it to other routes? The source mentions linking the NSR with the International North-South Transport Corridor, that's the INSTC for short, which is this massive network meant to connect India, Iran, Afghanistan, Russia, Central Asia, and all the way to Europe. You start linking those together, connecting them with Russia's unified deep water system, and suddenly you've got this massive network with huge potential to reduce costs and open up access to all sorts of new markets.
Right. So it's not just about the Arctic route itself, but about building this whole network of connections. And then there's the Chennai-Vladivostok Eastern Maritime Corridor. That one sounds particularly exciting, especially if it can be linked to the NSR. I mean, our source mentions they could cut travel time to Europe by 2 whole
Oh,
weeks.
yeah, that's huge. Think of the savings, not just in time, but also in fuel and all those logistical costs. The Chennai-Vladivostok corridor gives India this vital gateway to the east. And if you connect that with the NSR, suddenly you've got a really compelling alternative to those traditional routes that go through the Suez Canal or the Strait of Malacca. Plus, it positions India strategically in a way that becomes even more important when you consider the other players in the Arctic, especially China.
And that brings us to a really key question. How is India dealing with China's increasing presence in the Arctic? Our sources point out that China has been investing heavily in the Russian Arctic, something like $10 billion through their Polar Silk Road initiative. That's a pretty significant presence. What are India's concerns here, and what are their options?
Okay, so think back to India's core strategic goals. They want energy security, they want a bigger role in global trade, and now you have China investing heavily in a region that's so closely tied to Russia.
Yeah, I think it's understandable that they'd be concerned. And that's where collaboration with Russia on the NSR becomes a strategic move for India. Not just about the shipping route itself, but also about balancing out China's influence.
So it's almost like a two birds, one stone situation.
Mm.
By working with Russia on the NSR, India can secure access to those crucial energy resources, but they can also potentially prevent Russia from becoming too reliant on China.
Exactly. It's about maintaining a kind of strategic balance for everyone involved. If Russia were to become overly dependent on China's investment in infrastructure in the Arctic, that could have big implications for India's access and influence in the long run. So, a strong, multifaceted partnership with Russia on things like the NSR, that's a crucial countermeasure in this evolving geopolitical environment, especially when you consider that the Arctic itself is becoming more and more of a strategic battleground. Right. And our news source really paints a picture of just how competitive things are getting. You have China, which, isn't even geographically located in the Arctic, declaring itself a near-Arctic state. And with the ice melting and the region becoming more accessible, the stakes are rising. It's not just about resources anymore. It's about projecting power and influence in this strategically vital part of the world.
Yeah, absolutely. The Arctic is shedding its image as this remote and inaccessible region. It's becoming central to global strategy. China's declaration as a near-Arctic state, their investments, their plans for a nuclear-powered icebreaker, it all shows that they're in it for the long haul. And for India, navigating this complex environment means not just pursuing their sustainability goals, which they've clearly outlined in their Arctic policy, but also strengthening their strategic independence. They need a diverse network of international partnerships. And by engaging in Arctic affairs, they can protect their energy security and project their influence in what is undeniably becoming a multipolar world.
And a key part of that multipolar world, at least when it comes to the Arctic, seems to be India's relationship with Russia. Both of our sources emphasize just how important this connection is. I mean, Russia controls somewhere between 50 and 55% of the Arctic coastline. That makes them a natural, even essential partner for India's Arctic ambitions.
Yeah, it's more than just a good fit. It's pretty much a necessity if India wants to really engage in the Arctic. And you see that in their actions. They've invested, $15 billion in Russian oil and gas projects? That says a lot about how important this relationship is for their long-term energy needs. And it's not just about current investments. At the 22nd Indo-Russia Summit, they specifically committed to intensifying trade and investment in the Russian Far East and the Arctic.
Yeah.
It's a long-term strategic alignment.
And it's not just talk. They're taking concrete steps, right? They've set up this joint working group within the IRGC Tech framework specifically to boost collaboration on the NSR. Plus, they have this ambitious goal of increasing bilateral trade to $100 billion by 2030. The Arctic is clearly playing a bigger and bigger role in that economic partnership.
Definitely. And when you think about India's need for energy security, it makes this collaboration even more vital. Russia had something like 80% of the known oil and gas reserves in the Arctic. And for a rapidly growing economy like India, having access to those resources is absolutely crucial. It's more than just a simple economic transaction. It's a fundamental part of their energy strategy, especially as the global power balance shifts more and more towards Asia.
And it's really interesting to hear how Russia views this partnership. Our source on India's strategy quotes the Russian ambassador to India, emphasizing India's role as a constructive and stabilizing force in the Arctic. He even contrasted India's approach with what he sees as this, like, concerning trend of militarization from NATO and actions by other Arctic players that he feels have damaged the spirit of cooperation within the Arctic Council.
Yeah, I think that perspective is really significant. It shows how closely aligned India and Russia are when it comes to their concerns about military activities and unilateralism in the region. And the Russian ambassador's open support for India's presence, their commitment to joint research, environmental protection, commercial development, it all strengthens this alliance in the Arctic.
And those joint initiatives are pretty fascinating. I mean, they're cooperating on research in climate change, atmospheric studies, geosciences, glaciology, even polar biology. It shows a real commitment to understanding the complexities of the Arctic environment together.
Oh, totally. And it's not just about sharing academic knowledge. Indian scientists are directly involved in studying how the Arctic affects things like the South Asian monsoons. It highlights just how interconnected global climate systems really are. And the collaboration between institutions like Russia's Arctic and Antarctic Research Institute and India's National Center for Polar and Oceanic Research, well, that memorandum of understanding they signed in 2024 really solidified that commitment to research.
Right, and it goes beyond just understanding the environment. They're also looking at how to utilize those resources sustainably. Our sources mention exploring joint ventures in energy and mineral extraction, so there's a long-term economic commitment there from both India and Russia.
Yeah, and don't forget the growing maritime cooperation through the NSR. There are these ongoing discussions within the India-Russia Working Group about things like cargo transit, training for Indian sailors, and potential shipbuilding projects in the Arctic. They're really trying to make the NSR a reliable trade route, and the fact that they're negotiating a memorandum of understanding specifically for NSR cooperation shows just how serious they are about it.
Oh, and did you see that Russia has even offered India the use of some vacant research stations in the Arctic? That's a level of cooperation that really points to a deep strategic alignment. And Prime Minister Modi's 2023 visit to Moscow really emphasized the importance of this collaboration on the NSR. The goal is to establish this stable transport corridor across the whole greater Eurasian region. It's a partnership with some potentially huge implications.
Absolutely. It's a big deal. But while India is busy strengthening ties with Russia, we can't lose sight of the bigger picture. Our news source talks about these escalating tensions across the whole Arctic region. This isn't happening in a vacuum.
Exactly. So, shifting gears a bit to the broader Arctic landscape, our news source points out these concerns from international observers about these tensions. Some are even suggesting that if things aren't handled carefully, it could lead to conflict.
Yeah, I mean, the Arctic is becoming globally important, but that brings risks, right? And the strategic importance goes way beyond just India's interests. There's a massive amount of undiscovered oil and gas up there. Remember those USGS estimates?
Yeah.
Like 13% of the world's undiscovered oil and 30% of its untapped natural gas. Then you add in the rare earth elements, copper, phosphates, the fishing grounds that are becoming more accessible because of climate change. It's a lot.
And on top of all those resources, you've got the new commercial shipping routes, like the Northeast Passage, which could drastically shorten travel times between East Asia and Europe. And China's Polar Silk Road Initiative. That's all tied into this new maritime landscape.
Right. And while you have the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, UNCLOS for short, which, is supposed to provide a framework for managing all these competing interests, the reality is you have all these overlapping territorial claims from different Arctic nations. The U.S., Canada, Russia, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, Finland, Iceland. They've all submitted claims to the UN Commission on the limits of the continental shelf. And if those claims are recognized, it gives those countries control over huge stretches of the Arctic seabed and all the resources that come with it.
Yeah, and the news source gives some really specific examples of the tensions that are bubbling up, like the dispute between the U.S. and Canada over the Northwest Passage. Canada says it's their internal waters. The U.S. says it's an international strait. And then there was that whole thing with the U.S. trying to buy Greenland from Denmark. Talk about a power move.
Yeah, definitely a bold move, and it really shows how interested countries outside the Arctic Circle are in this region. Then you have Russia, which already has a strong foothold in the Arctic. They've been reviving old military bases, planting flags on the seabed. Remember that in 2007. And some of their recent comments about Norway's Svalbard archipelago have raised concerns within NATO. Plus, you have the strained relations between Russia and other Arctic Council members since the start of the Ukraine conflict. It just adds another layer of complexity.
And then you bring NATO and China into the mix, and it gets even more complicated. With Sweden and Finland joining NATO, you have a bigger military presence in the Arctic, including those military exercises near Russia's border. And China, despite not being an Arctic nation, they're building ties with Russia, conducting joint naval drills, and they have those plans for a nuclear-powered icebreaker. It's making some Western powers nervous, to say the least.
It's all connected, right? The Arctic isn't some isolated place anymore. It's at the center of global power struggles.
Yeah.
The competition for energy, the military posturing, the push for trade dominance. It's all happening up there. And if countries don't work together, if they don't engage in diplomacy, the risk of conflict is going to keep rising. Plus, we can't forget about the environmental impact of all this activity. It's a delicate ecosystem up there.
So to sum it all up for our listeners, it's pretty clear that India is trying to find their place in a rapidly changing Arctic. They're working to balance their own energy and economic needs with the realities of geopolitics, especially when it comes to China and their growing partnership with Russia. But all of this is happening against a backdrop of rising international tension in the Arctic, and that has big implications for everyone.
And that leads us to a question for you to think about. Given everything we've discussed, India's ambitions, the instability in the region, what do you think are the biggest risks and opportunities for India in the Arctic? And what about the future of the Arctic itself? It's a complex issue that involves national interests, the need for global cooperation, and the responsibility to protect this fragile environment.
Yeah, it's definitely something for all of us to consider as the Arctic continues to transform.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Lots to think about as this story unfolds.